Hello YouTube, and welcome to my channel. I'm going to try a new style of video. Instead of trying to create a single comprehensive thesis that I elaborate on for 20 minutes or so, which takes me a long time to script and prevents me from uploading frequently, I'm going to address 3 different points which may or may not be related more briefly. If you guys like this video style, I could probably commit to doing these once a month or so. So I'll be reading the comments for your reactions. Let's jump into it. The left and police abolition. Unless you've been living under a rock, you're probably aware that there has been significant violence and unrest following the death of George Floyd. Very quickly, the left has harnessed this energy and has started calling for the abolition of the police. Now, what abolish the police actually means is something the left is still working out. Some actually want to completely get rid of police forces. Others only want to narrow the scope of police responsibilities and reallocate funding for things like drugs and behavioral crises to other municipal agencies. Now, these ideas have varying degrees of plausibility and merit, but I don't want to focus on whether abolishing the police is a good idea or not. Rather, what I want to focus on is why the left rallied around the term abolish the police, and what this reveals about the left. So, if you listen to the Distributist's latest stream, at around the 53-minute mark, there is a discussion about the idea of abolishing prisons. And Distributist noted that the left obviously doesn't want rapists and murderers to go free. Rather, what they want is to identify criminals as people who are sick, and since they are sick people, they need to be taken to hospitals that they are restrained in and cannot leave. Obviously, these are just prisons by another name, and there are other examples of this. Instead of forced labor, which is bad, you have community service, which is good. Instead of police officers, which are bad, you have community resource officers or peace officers, and these are good. So the Distributist asks, why is the left obsessed with these rhetorical tricks? My argument is that this is not just a rhetorical trick. This is an example of the left's necessary rejection of authority as theorized by Italian philosopher Augusto Del Noce. As an aside, my video Imagine No Dialectics is an introduction to his thought and might be helpful as a knowledge base before this particular section. Anyway, for the left, it is important to rename police and prisons because of what they represent. Essentially, leftism demands total freedom and equality among individuals, but this freedom requires a rejection of dependency and authority. You can't be free if you are dependent on something else or if something else has authority over you. It is for this reason that the left rejects tradition, God, the family, etc. And this is the fundamental thing to understand about leftism. Leftism doesn't begin from dialectical materialism and arrive at the conclusion that authority, especially transcendental authority, is bad. These are presuppositions necessary to arrive at dialectical materialism. The worldview the progressive constructs, and in fact the very words progressive, modern, history, etc., require this. Authority is the subjugation of becoming to being. So God, the natural world, and human tradition has a certain authority over human action. For the progressive, however, authority must be negated in order to affirm his own freedom against nature and tradition. So instead, there is a process called history, from which man has liberated himself by his own power from the external tyranny of religion and nature through scientific advancement. And this history is a story of development towards an endpoint. Hegel's End of History, and Marx's post-revolutionary utopia. Police officers and jails represent the old authority that must be swept aside by the revolution. So, progressivism, by necessity, must reject authority, and prisons and police represent a kind of authority. When leftists say they want to abolish police or prisons, they don't mean get rid of what the police and prisons actually do. They want to get rid of the authority that the police and prisons represent, and instead replace them with hospitals and community resource officers. They may do the same thing, but a police officer or prison implies an external authority and laws of human action to which the progressive is subjected to. The progressive cannot accept this without denying the very presuppositions for progressive thought. However, there is no contradiction for progressivism to affirm that people can have psychological diseases that predispose them to violence, and that these people need to be locked away until they are cured, if curing them is even possible. That is why it is necessary for the left to claim they want to abolish the police, even though in practice they are doing no such thing. And for us reactionaries, there is a darker side to this that the Distributist mentioned but was foreseen almost 40 years ago by Del Noce. Now, in the countries that claim to be democratic, opponents of modernity are criticized on the grounds that their positions reflect the hidden conservatism or reactionary spirit that characterize a repressed psychology. above all in the fields of culture, but more and more also in politics. The totalitarian spirit is already at work in these criticisms. Unlike Stalinism or Hitlerism, it is not a political movement that aims at world domination. It is instead a quest to bring about the disintegration of one part of the world, in the case at hand, Europe. Nevertheless, the word totalitarianism is still appropriate because the essential features remain the same. The individual is extinguished and the idea of politics is subsumed within the idea of war, even in peacetime. This means that all forms of criticism must be prevented whenever they are addressed at real power, because instead of advancing rational arguments, supposedly they reflect or conceal the conservatism or reactionary spirit that are typical of a repressed psychology. Fukuyama and the End of History. For those that don't know, Francis Fukuyama is one of the most influential writers of our lifetime. He was fundamental in founding neoconservatism, though he has since distanced himself from that school of politics. Fukuyama, however, is best known for his work, The End of History and The Last Man. In this 1992 work, Francis Fukuyama argued that with the fall of the Soviet Union, the triumph of liberalism was assured, and as he said, what we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War, or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. Obviously, his work is way too dense to get into, but we can extract some brief points that are central to his political philosophy. 1. History is a unidirectional process of growth in human knowledge and standards of living. 2. The correlation between a nation's average wealth and its implementation of liberal democracy shows that liberal democracy is the endpoint of the process of history. 3. Because technological growth and scientific knowledge, which are the drivers of liberal democracy and wealth, are cumulative, the current global order will not regress out of internal problems. 4. Finally, as some of you might have noticed, Fukuyama himself says that his thesis is essentially Marxist, in that it's essentially a process of dialectical materialism. The only difference is that the endpoint is not communism, but liberal democracy. Now, there are many objections and responses to his thesis, but I'm going to focus on the two that interest me most. First, the problem of culture. In his most recent book, Identity, The Demand for Dignity, Fukuyama speaks positively about national identity and the importance of rebuilding the American national identity. Now, it should be noted that Fukuyama identifies national identity as civic nationalism, but Fukuyama ties the idea of national identity to dignity, and he's been pretty consistent on that point. Fukuyama is very clear that he sees the diversity of nations as good, and has said that Davos man, the rootless cosmopolitan homo economicus that his critics accuse his philosophy of engendering, is a horrifying vision of the future that he does not want. However, he's also insistent on the need to strengthen international organizations like NATO, the UN, and the EU, and he doesn't seem to reply to people who believe that NATO, the UN, and the EU are in fact detrimental to national identity. Furthermore, it's kind of unclear what Fukuyama considers national identity to be. On the one hand, he seems to describe American identity as a kind of pride in liberal democracy. Yet Americanism must be something more than this because he believes that all nations should be liberal democracy. Furthermore, when he speaks of other countries and cultures, preserving these nations' cultures seem to revolve around minor things like food or architecture. So the question is, if as Fukuyama says national identity is important, what is national identity according to Fukuyama? In a liberal democratic world, what is it that separates the Japanese and American national identities? And more importantly, what claims do these national identities have against supranational organizations like the UN? Is culture really just food and architecture? Or is it something more important related to religion, metaphysics, and ethics? And when these religious, metaphysical, and ethical claims come into contradiction with the claims of liberal democracy, which will triumph? The other criticism is a little more abstract. When presented with counterexamples to his thesis, poor African dictatorships, anti-democratic Islamic states, the swing to the right in Eastern Europe, the Russian and Chinese models of development, and the rise of national populism in American and British electorates, Fukuyama gives essentially the same response. Yes, there are places where liberal democracy hasn't fully settled in, or is even temporarily backsliding, but these are essentially the exceptions that confirm the rule. Trump country, the Middle East, sub-Saharan Africa, and former communist countries are all pretty miserable places to live, especially when compared to their immediate neighbors. They are essentially the backwaters of liberal democracy, and in a few generations they will either get with the program or collapse from internal problems. But this doesn't seem to be satisfactory, and here are at least some of the reasons why. 1. It seems that with every successive decade, the list of these exceptions is growing. Even Fukuyama himself, as evidenced by his successive writings, acknowledges that liberal democracy's victory lap around the globe has taken longer than he thought it would back in the 90s, and its triumph seems less and less sure. At what point can we say that liberal democracy does not work, has not worked, or cannot work in certain places or for certain people before we can begin questioning the entire system? 2. On a related note, can it not be hypothesized that liberal democracy in fact requires these backwaters to exist? That in fact liberal democracy's success can only be attributed to the fact that it extracts wealth from the large working class to a small investor and developer class that generates innovation? Liberal democracy may increase everybody's paycheck through technological innovation, but only by generating vast income inequalities both between individuals in countries and between countries themselves. Given this, and the fact that Fukuyama has rightly identified wealth inequalities as a threat to democratic institutions, is democratic liberalism fundamentally unstable? Does it suffer from Del Noce's heterogenesis of ends, in that its success creates the very conditions for its destruction? Finally, and this connects to a lot that's already been said, Fukuyama's recent writing admits that politics has recently become more identified with identity and social issues rather than with economic issues. This is already a big concession for him, but he seems to be under the impression that this is a small fix for his system. Essentially, that dialectical materialism is a fundamentally good model, and just needs a small patch to account for why people do things for religious and cultural reasons. But dialectical materialism, as we said before, requires a denial of metaphysics and ethics a priori to get off the ground. It is fundamentally a secular system, and you can't simply patch these things in later. Insofar as Fukuyama's liberal democracy is dependent on dialectical materialism, how can it possibly make room for God without crashing? And if the answer, which Fukuyama has suggested, is that it can't make room for God, then can religious people seriously believe that liberal democracy will make room for them? An analogy for the Trinity. Earlier this week, I saw a thread on Twitter by a Muslim arguing that the Trinity is illogical. The thread is pretty long and easy to find, and some of the minor points are just uninteresting misconceptions of Christian thought, so I won't reproduce it in its entirety here. Instead, I want to look at the much more interesting core argument, which basically is as follows. 1. Christians distinguish between the three persons of God and the substance of God. 2. Either two of those persons, the Son and Holy Spirit, are dependent on the first, the Father, or they are all dependent on the substance of God. 3. If it's the first, then why call the Son and Spirit God? Aren't they creatures just like angels and human beings? If it's the second, then aren't there four persons of the Trinity, the substance, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit? 5. Either way, the Christian perspective on the Trinity is absurd. Now, the first prong of this dilemma can be pretty easily dismissed because this is the Arian contention which has been responded to many times before in Christian history. The Son and the Holy Spirit are not creatures of the Father because they are not created by the Father. Creation implies an act that is accidental or contingent. A carpenter can create a chair, or he could choose not to. God the Father could not choose not to generate the Son because it is in the nature of God for that generation to occur. For a more detailed explanation, check out the third video in my Proving the Existence of God series. Furthermore, creation occurs in time, whereas the processions of the Trinity occur eternally. The Father is eternally begetting the Son. Thus the Son and Spirit can be said to be dependent on God, not in the sense creatures are, in that their existence depends on God, but in the way that the conclusion of an argument is dependent on its premises as principles. What I want to spend more time on, however, is the second prong. What is the relationship between the substance of God and the persons of God? St. Augustine tells us that the substance is prior to the persons, but this is clearly not meant temporally, so how is it meant? Now, obviously, trying to understand God completely is outside the scope of human thought, but I think it's possible to give an analogy that imperfectly captures the relationship between what we refer to the substance of God and the persons of God. And I think that analogy is visibility. Consider that in the material world we call some objects visible and other objects invisible. What do we mean when we say an object is visible? Obviously, we mean that we can see it, but it means more than that. For example, I know that there are people in China, but I cannot see any Chinese people right now. It does not follow, therefore, that Chinese people are invisible. Clearly, visibility does not simply mean currently being seen. It means that something has a property or potential to be seen. But what does something have to have in order to have this property? All visible things have a shape, size, and color. Interestingly, all things that have a shape also have a size and color, and all things with a size also have a shape and color, and so on and so forth. There is a certain interdependence between shape, size, and color, such that any object that has one also has the other two. Now, shape, size, and color are not dependent on visibility in such a way that visibility creates them, but visibility is the principle by which they are understood, and their relationships to each other are understood. Similarly, shape, size, and color are not three independent parts of visibility like the three layers of a cake, but they are all implied by visibility and they imply each other. In the same way, the persons of God are not dependent on the substance in such a way that the substance creates them, but the substance is the principle by which the persons and their relationships to each other are understood. Similarly, the persons are not part of the substance of God, but they are implied by the substance and they imply each other. Thus, it is perfectly rational to say that there are three persons in one substance without confounding the persons or dividing the substance. So, those are my thoughts for the month. Let me know what you think, and also let me know what you think of this format. Until next time, I'm Benedict XVI. Go with God.